always made fun of him, but I'm going to let him be up here anyway. So JB, obviously, as a worship leader, he has Remix Worship. He also leads worship at a church that he is a part of. And Alexa, you've heard a lot about her background. And so I'll start off with the first question for Alexa. Being 19 years old is when you started Please Live, right?
Yes, that's correct.
What were the biggest obstacles, especially as a young person, 19 years old, starting your own nonprofit organization?
Oh my goodness. Okay, so yes, I was 19 whenever I felt that God kind of grabbed hold of my heart and told me to start a nonprofit. And the first thing I said was no, no thanks, because that sounds really big and that sounds really scary, and I'm in college and I'm super broke, and what is a nonprofit? And so there were many terrifying questions with just this big vision that God gave me. And so I think grappling with that was the challenge. I was trying to understand, is this actually from God? Am I trying to be some sort of superstar? Where is this motivation coming from? Am I actually going to make a difference? And so I actually have two answers for that. The first challenge was really, is this actually what God wants me to do? And I remember thinking to myself, this might be what God is telling me to do, or maybe I'm getting it wrong. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to put my whole heart into it. And if it fails, then it fails. No harm, no foul. I can always do something else. Like if this falls through, it's not like the end of my life. And so I, wasn't entirely sure if it was God, but I decided I'm going to pursue this. I'm going to throw my whole heart and into this. I'm going to try and get people to help me with it. And if I fail, then I fail. And in the process of failing, maybe I'll reach one or two people. And so far, I haven't failed. And so I guess it actually was God. And then the second piece of that was, understanding, like, it's kind of, I kind of addressed it already, but that fear of failure. And understanding, like, I'm 19 years old. How could I honestly know what I'm doing for the rest of my life? No one at 19 should have, like, their plan all set in stone, because life happens. And I was like, really, like, do I really have it all together at 19? That doesn't seem right. What if I fail? And again, I came to this realization that we have life in seasons, and Please Live may be my season right now, and it may not be my next season, and that's okay. That doesn't make what I'm doing now any less powerful or any less impactful if someday Please Live no longer exists. And so it was really kind of understanding, my two biggest challenges, is this actually what God is telling me to do, and what if I fail? And understanding and coming to grips with those two questions is kind of what allowed me to move forward.
That's awesome. And that's like very biblical too, because it says to test and approve God's will. And, sometimes we can get so caught up on the details and be nervous. And then, imagine if Alexa just said no to the calling. Imagine
I did.
Well, she did. Imagine if she said no again. But imagine, just wrestling with that, and it is hard, but think of all the people that God has already lined up, because it says that in the Bible that God has already ordained in advance good deeds for you to do. He's setting up every single day divine appointments, every single day. So there's always going to be people out there for you that have been designed for you to reach. And if you really think about it, God is calling you now to make steps. You need to make step 1, and maybe at step 10, you're going to make this impact. And step 25, you're going to make this impact. But it's all about just saying yes in the now and just being obedient to God. So question for JB, especially as a worship leader, like working in a church or just being a worship leader, what are the most difficult things, that you find in being a worship leader, like the things that might be just difficult in being in ministry in that facet?
Yeah, one of the biggest things I think these days is this balance between I kind of call it the worship wars, between like this more traditional style versus this more contemporary style. And I actually had the opportunity to preach a sermon on it a couple months ago, and I always go back to 2 Samuel 6, which is the story of David with his men bringing the Ark of the Covenant back to Jerusalem So the first time that they go, and it's a really bad situation where Uzzah touches the ark when he's not supposed to. You know, God commands them to carry it on the poles on the shoulders of Levites, and they're doing that, and the ox stumbles, and this guy reaches out and he touches the Ark of the Covenant, and he's struck dead right there. But the biggest thing is that sorry, man, I apologize. God told him the way that it was supposed to be done. And so often, and like to us, that would be like a really good thing to do, to like save the Ark of the Covenant. But that's not how God instructed them to do it. So there's a lot of, no matter which side of it you're on, there's always good things with both parts of worship, whether it's the older style or the newer style. There's good in a lot of it. But what I try to tell people is, what is God doing in your context? And trying to figure out what God's doing in your church in this time, in this context. That's the most important thing, because it's not just about pushing an agenda. It's not just about like, well, this is the way that we always done it, so that's how we're going to do it. Or I see this movement of new music, so we just have to go in this direction, and that's just what we're going to do. Really, it's always that sort of down the middle. But to find people that are willing to sacrifice. So in that story, at the end of the day, when they finally take the Ark of the Covenant and they're going to do it the right way, the Bible tells us that every 6 steps they took, they stopped and they made a sacrifice of a fattened animal. What does it say? A fattened animal, and I think an ox. Basically, there was 2. So it was a 9-mile journey from the house of Obed-Edom, where the Ark of the Covenant was, to Mount Zion. And a lot of sacrifices had to be made that day. So what I try to tell people in all of that, everybody has to bring a sacrifice, it doesn't matter what side you're on, and getting people to come on board with you and not just make it about one preference is huge, but to kind of see the bigger picture.
No, and that's solid. I mean, and that's something I've always heard from people. It's more about the heart than it is the art.
For sure.
Yeah. So, you got to realize that you could have, like with our church, it's very traditional. We have pipe organ. You don't see that much anymore. But, we have pipe organs and hymns, or you could have, like they have here with the, very, contemporary Christian music. You could have either one of those, but if your heart is in the right place, then there's really no point to even just engaging, because you're not really in that right place. And so it's, that's why it's so important to do that. So does anybody out here have any questions? Don't be shy. Yes, thank you. I have to check live stream too to make sure if there's any others. So.
Ooh, we're live.
All right. So you are live, just reminding. So in regards to mental health, church as a whole, how do you feel the church has done as a whole in dealing with the issue of mental health? And as church leaders or in leadership, or if there's anyone here in the church, what is some advice you can give the church as a whole to deal with the issue of mental health, especially as it's growing today?
Yeah, great question. So what I have seen in the church is that I feel like in a lot of ways the church is just slightly behind society. Like we get the really fun rock music, and then in a couple years the rock music shows up in worship, or some scientific thought happens, and then in a couple years later the church finally catches up. And that's what I'm seeing in mental health as well. I'm seeing kind of society is starting to really have a more medical, more scientific view of mental health, mental illnesses, understanding not only like the chemical components of serotonin and dopamine within the physical aspect of your brain, but even things like childhood trauma, being trauma-informed communities and understanding the impact that has. We're seeing that more in societies and in schools, and I'm seeing that the church is just now starting to catch up. And so that's good. It's good that I'm seeing the church catching up, but there are still a lot of churches that are still so stuck in this idea that if you're depressed, you can just pray it away. And we don't think that way about cancer. And in fact, if we think about how something like, HIV, back in like the 70s and 80s, if somebody got HIV, it was because you were a bad person, and people wouldn't tell their families. They would get their diagnosis and they would keep it a secret because there was such a stigma. There was this idea that you have HIV or you're HIV positive because you're a bad person and God has given this to you as a judgment. And today, we don't see that stigma anymore. We understand that HIV is an illness. Anyone can get an illness, Christians included. But we're still seeing the realm of mental health catching up to that. There are still people that believe that if you're depressed or if you're anxious, then you're not truly saved. And if you just pray harder, if you just read your Bible more, then it's just going to cure you. And that's just not the reality. In the same way that mental illnesses are illnesses of the brain, it's the same as, cancer or illnesses of our cells, or diabetes is a illness of our pancreas and our insulin levels. And Christians can suffer with it just like any other person on this planet. Churches need to recognize that and be not afraid to address it. I am seeing that start to happen, so I have hope for that. And I'm hoping that more and more churches will understand that being depressed, being anxious, having thoughts of suicide, self-harm, PTSD, eating disorders, that does not inherently make you a bad person, and that does not mean that God is punishing you, and it does not mean that God does not love you. Our God is the God of all illnesses, including mental health.
And even, as a pastor, I never mentioned that at the beginning, but I'm an associate pastor here. But, just working with a lot of different churches over the years, and then working at this church too, we do see there is an older generation that has seen a lot of, basically, it's really easy to brush that stuff under the rug, when we see these things, and instead of talking about it. And like Alexa said, having that conversation where we're starting to talk about it, having, that's really the start of it all, is if we can actually, just even like with our sin, even in church, which obviously is a separate thing, but like, sometimes we're so easy to try to put up a front and try to look our best and act our best, but inside we've got this junk going on, or we're hurting, or we're dealing with things. And, until we try to be more of a transparent community in the church in general, that's I think one of the biggest things. And if we can actually have a conversation, I feel like it's going to be easier to start dealing with those issues as well. It's going to be a big thing.
To add on, you had asked, what kind of advice would I give? And my biggest advice, I'm an educator, and so I encourage education. And in the same way that I think everybody should have a basic first aid course, because you never know if you're going to run into someone in a medical emergency, I think everybody should be educated on what to do in basic mental health first aid, and what to do, whether you're, especially staff members, and especially within the church, because hurting people end up at Jesus oftentimes, and they look for those answers in places of worship. And so I highly encourage education, learning about how to recognize and deal with those kinds of issues, especially as a church, especially as a staff member, as a parent, as a community member.
Yeah, and that's something that, with working with Please Live and working with other organizations, I've gotten the mental health first aid certification, and, it's like an 8-hour course, and it's so important, because now, not only when I'm here at the church, but then, at my full-time job, I'm talking with an employee, and something that might have just seemed like, having a bad day, then you start to see the certain signs and symptoms, and you understand things more. And, especially as a Christian, whether you're a leader or not, our job is to help and to give hope to somebody who's feel hopeless, and no better way to do that than to be educated and prepared. Yep. Awesome. All right. Any other questions? Any other questions? Travis, hold up. Get my exercise in. I'm
Run,
not ashamed.
man, run.
Steps.
All right, my question's for JB. How do you, when you're leading worship, how do you balance it in the sense of you, worshiping God rather than more of making it like a show for the audience? Or for yourself, how do you connect with God rather than wanting to just do it to perform for the audience?
Yeah. Great question. I think the thing that automatically people just jump to is kind of the presentation of it. Sometimes automatically, if there's lights, or if the music's at a certain decibel, it kind of lends itself to the more concert show feel. but I always just bring it back to heart posture, which is kind of, for somebody on the outside, it's, a little difficult to evaluate. Really only that person knows their true intentions of it. But I mean, it is all about God. I kind of spoke about it a little bit in our worship set today. I've been really studying recently the Tabernacle of David. And there's a book out that I'm actually leading at my church right now. It's called How to Worship a King by Zach Neese. He's from Gateway Church in Texas. But whenever God gives a lot of detail to something, there's always like a purpose for it. When God says something's going to be this way and it's going to look like this, it's not just like random information, but there's purpose and a design behind it. So the way that the tabernacle is set up is the way that Zach explains in the book is sort of how we are supposed to worship. And the first stop when you'd enter the gates of the tabernacle, it's you find yourself at the altar. So I always say like the first step is sacrifice, like just completely, laying down whatever it is before the Lord and giving it all to Him, because that's what He did for us. Oh, that sacrifice came first. The second step is what they call the laver. I'm not sure how you say it, but it's the laver. Thank you, Dan. Old Testament, right there. You're the man. So that's the washing station for the priest, right? So the second step would be cleansing yourself by the word. And we do that a lot in worship. But I think in a lot of American churches today, in our worship gatherings, that's where it ends. The next step, whether it's the table of showbread or the altar of incense or Ark of the Covenant, when you go deeper into the tabernacle, where there's more intimacy between you and the Lord, this deeper connection, where the ministry is done. Those first two steps, like I shared earlier, was ministry from God to the people. And then once you hit those deeper, intimate moments of worship, it's ministry from the people back to God. And I don't always see that in the church today. But I think when you get there, then you're not worried about yourself. You kind of get out of that show element. It's no longer about, God, what can you do for me? Or how can I look good or whatever, doing what I do? But God, it's really about you. And so I think those are kind of the questions to ask. How do we make it more about Him?
Yeah, and that's something, we've both been worship leaders at separate churches and playing together too. And one of the things I've always loved about just Remix and their ministry is just like, even I've had a crazy week personally, and like right before even coming up here, instead of being like, okay, what's my set list, or how are we gonna nail that guitar solo, like, JB is like, hey man, yeah, JB always screws up his guitar solo. No, I'm just kidding. But one of the things, they stopped and we're like, they're like, hey guys, let's pray together, like, just that, like you said, heart posture. It's about humility and about having your heart and your mind in the right spot. Yeah, so cool. All right, well, we'll take one more question, I think, and then we'll get into the worship set. So does anybody have a doozy they would like to ask? Anything like, just like a mic drop kind of question? Nothing? Okay.
For Alexa.
Yeah. We'll
Bring it
be
on, I'll
delegating
take it.
this to Alexa.
I like the tough ones.
Especially, obviously anything worship or mental health related. Okay, we have a final question from my mother-in-law.
Oh, no.
Alexa.
It's for me, don't worry.
Alexa. Does every person have a little mental illness? That's my first question.
First question?
And my second is, how do you make a person admit that they have it?
Oh, good ones. So not everyone has a mental illness, but everyone can experience one. And so what I mean by that, I often describe depression or anxiety kind of similar to like the flu. Like you can get the flu and then you can recover from it, and then like next year at flu season, you can get the flu again. It doesn't mean you had the flu the entire time. You just had periods. And that happens to a lot of people. In fact, we are learning, as we learn more about the brain, as we learn more about, mental health as, an entire field, we are learning that everyone will experience a bout of mental illness at one point or another. So we will all probably experience something bad, but that doesn't mean that everybody is ill. So that's the difference there. Not everybody is living every day with an illness, but we will all probably experience seasons of depression or anxiety or something to that effect. The second answer is how do you get someone to admit that they have something? And this is one of the hardest questions in the mental health field, because when we're working it, it's so easy to see people who are hurting and who are struggling, and they don't want to address it. They don't want to see it for whatever reason. Maybe they are afraid that people are going to see them as being weak. Maybe they are afraid that, someone's going to treat them differently because, if I have an illness, then someone's going to think I'm crazy or what have you. There's a lot of fear associated with that. And unfortunately, there is no tried and true message to force someone to see what they don't want to see. And so our job, not only as Christians, but as community members, is that if we're loving on someone who doesn't want to see it yet, we just have to be patient. We have to love on them. We have to pray for them until they're ready to see it. And when they're ready to see it, then we're ready to step into action and to help them in whatever way we can. I wish there was a way that we could just show someone, this is you, get help, talk to someone. But as of right now, unfortunately, that just doesn't exist. We have to be loving and gracious and prayerful until they're ready to see it.
Well, let's give them a round of applause for their time. This was great. Thank you. And Remix is going to close us out with some worship.